Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome. If we could just settle down because we're about to start. I'm deeply honored to be in conversation with Sofka Zinovieff. Am I pronouncing the last name correctly?
Zinovieff.
Zinovieff. Sorry, I wanted to check that with you. Absolute pleasure and delighted that you're at the festival, Sofka. So we're going to be talking about Sofka's novel Putney today, which I've just finished reading, and it has just blown my mind, really. So there's a lot to unpack. Sofka, I want to start by talking about braiding the personal with the political. Putney is a novel that brings up this all too important conversation around consent, around abuse, and it does so without hitting the reader on the head with a sledgehammer, which is not easy to do, because it never turns into a preachy, didactic sort of novel. At its core, it's still telling a profoundly personal and intimate story. Talk to us about creating the architecture of such a novel where, you're pulling from reality, but it's not turning into a moralizing lesson. Let's start there.
Okay, I think when I began writing Putney, I wanted to explore a situation that was similar to certain things I'd seen in my own youth, but also very similar to lots of other stories that had happened. So it's partly taken from my life, but also inspired by many other things. And I was very determined that what I wanted to explore was the sort of abuse that was just at that point coming into focus, in that every other day on the news, one would see and hear and read stories. Bring myself closer, like that. Okay. That there were all these men being arrested for historical cases of child sexual abuse. And this was something quite new. It was, I suppose, around 15 years ago. And it was, what's going on here? There's been a reckoning. But what I also understood was that it wasn't always the sort of abuse that we picture of some evil person coming out of the shadows with a knife. Yeah. That actually, quite often these relationships involve close personal friendship and even love. Abuse often comes from family members, a kindly uncle, a nice family friend, and often the man himself, as it's often a man or the woman, can believe that they are involved in a love story. And so can young girls. It's a very classic thing, and young boys. And what is not clear, I think, for the people often involved in these stories is that it is wrong. It is an imbalance of power. It is without consent if consent is set at a certain age. So inevitably it becomes politicized. And what was so strange was that, having written this book where I give voice to the man who loves young Daphne, he is absolutely madly in love with her, and she falls in love with him. And this is a risky thing to do. When I wrote the book, on the one hand, people have said about it, it's like giving a voice to Lolita. So like Nabokov's Lolita, instead of viewing the girl as an object, she is given agency and a voice. And so I very much wanted to have both the perpetrator, Ralph, the young girl, Daphne, and the observer who sees it all, who is Jane, Daphne's school friend. And so we have this sense of them involved in each other in a complex web, and then decades later trying to unpick that web with our changed ideas about sexual abuse.
I love that, Sofka, because my next question was literally going to be that, to say that we've heard this from the voices and perspectives of multiple people rather than just giving us, say, Daphne's perspective. So I'm going to skip that question, but you've also said that you were intrigued by the idea of examining the gray zones of an illicit relationship between a 13-year-old girl who believed she was in love with an older man. And what I loved, Sofka, was that in your style of writing and storytelling, there are no clear black and white, good or bad people. There are no goodies and baddies, as you call them. Especially about Ralph, you've said, I was unwilling to paint him in the brash black and white of baddie. You know, because all too often we get these cardboard cutout characters of that's the villain, that's the, hero, however you frame it. And similarly about Jane, whilst she's the one who coaxes Daphne to press charges, her intentions are not entirely clear either. So talk a little bit about what makes you gravitate towards these muddier, sort of more grey areas of ambiguity in a sense.
I would say that I am fascinated by the grey areas. And this is partly to do with the sort of person I am. I think the world that I grew up in, which was quite a chaotic world in Putney, this suburb of London, with parents who, they were just going into the sort of bohemian London of the 1970s. They led a very free life, I would say, and that left a lot of room for children to be able to live their own lives, but also see a lot. And I knew several men, I would say, who are not unlike Ralph. So somebody very charismatic, very talented. Ralph is a very successful composer in this book. He has a huge amount of success and is reaping the rewards for this. But at the same time, he is not very good at reflecting on his own morality and what he has done to harm people. But I think that what my editor at the time said is, oh, Ralph's a narcissist. Well, I hadn't thought about that myself, of putting a sort of label, but as we know, certain people who are narcissists, they can be these larger-than-life, charismatic people who take all the energy in the room and make you love them. And so this is what Ralph is. Of course, when he begins, when Daphne's very young to give her presents and he adores her. And I wanted to see it in these shades of grey, that it's never it's not like this is bad and that's good, because there's also friendship. There's generosity, there's all sorts of things going on which are these kind of shadier areas, and that's always what interests me. I find characters in books or films who are laid out as this is the goodie, that's the baddie, and we know where we are, and well, end of story. I find that a bit dull.
That's absolutely right. That can get a bit boring. And that's also just how life is, isn't it? It is complex, and it's Sofka, there's a particular scene in Putney where Daphne's father is reacting to her telling him about her childhood abuse. And it's an egocentric and disturbing sort of scene. Talk a little bit about writing that moment and how common this in fact might be across the world, but in particular in our country, where we live. It's so relatable, Sofka.
That's very interesting to hear. Obviously, parents always love their children, but they don't always love them in the most helpful way.
Sure.
And I think that's probably where the connection is. So when Daphne's father, when he's aged 80, is told by Daphne, who has suddenly realized that actually this thing she always saw as a rather naughty, romantic adventure of first love actually was abuse, and that it's had quite a big effect on her life without her realizing it. So I think when she goes to see her father, she's wanting something back from him. There's no accusing of her parents of having been neglectful, but I think that the understory and the implication is that they were neglectful. They allowed their friend to come into their house and start having a relationship with their daughter. So it's very understandable that Daphne's father immediately feels afraid, defensive, worried, anxious, doesn't know what to do, people often prefer to deny that something has happened rather than face up to the very messy task of unpicking it. It's back to your question about black and white or grey, because for him to think that somebody he'd collaborated with, he was a writer and had collaborated with an opera with Ralph, and so this was a very difficult thing. And I think he just felt better to say, you know, no, this can't really be, and to walk away from it. Also, an older generational thing, I don't know about here, but certainly in my part of Europe and Britain, I think that an older generation will hold things in and not necessarily want to let everything out in the open, you know, wash their dirty linens outside, show what their inner workings of their hearts are, whereas the generations of psychotherapy and revealing more about ourselves has been a more recent thing. So I think that plays a part probably as well.
Yeah. Lots of relatability there, Sofka. Now, as a social anthropologist myself, Sofka's anthropology background really screamed out at me, and I remember I sent Razi a message saying, Sofka's an anthropologist, that's so exciting. And Sofka, you've said that your training as an anthropologist has taught you to sort of suspend judgment in order to understand someone else. And when I read that, I thought, gosh, that's a skill we certainly need more of in the world, just kind of putting yourself in the shoes of someone whose life might be at a departure from yours. Talk a little bit about your anthropology foundation and kind of what this lends to your proclivity towards fiction. How do the two kind of marry in a sense?
I think that studying social anthropology and then doing a PhD in it was a wonderful beginning for being a writer.
Yeah.
I remember going to live in a small town in Greece as a research student and being so excited by speaking to every sort of person. I think, my goodness, I've spoken with a communist in the morning, with a right-wing, almost fascist in the afternoon. I've gone out to a nightclub with a sort of shady nightlife people. I would just speak with everybody. And that was so refreshing to me that I'd stepped outside my own world. I was only the person presenting myself to them there. And so I think that ability to walk around a subject and not take a very direct judgment on it, to understand that people have many different ways of living and what their beliefs are. And in fact, rather naughtily, I put into Ralph's mouth the words that, in every different society, girls can be married at 13 and there's nothing wrong with this, and, you just have to open up your boundaries a little bit more and not be so prim, and, and this is true, that if we look through history in different eras or we look in different societies, the age of consent for sex or the age of marriage or these sort of things have varied hugely what we consider is right. And so I always had that in the back of my mind, that in Britain it's rape if you have sex with a 13-year-old girl. That's why I made her Daphne 13, is that I wanted it to be at least there, rather black and white. What was the problem? That it was illegal and he could be liable to being arrested for doing that. But I am very aware of how one does have to think around these subjects in an open-minded way.
Sofka, there are internal self-censors in all of us, and as a storyteller, I think this becomes particularly salient when you're sort of grappling with issues such as the ones in Putney. The thorny issues. I'm curious to ask you, are there any guardrails that you have when you're putting the story together, and sort of how much goes in, how much gets left out? And especially with Putney, was there any trepidation about how some of this might land or be received? Or are you kind of more uncensored in a sense?
I believe in censoring once you've written something, especially in fiction.
Yeah.
I think if you thought, oh, I'm writing about sex, is my mother going to read this?
Oh,
Nobody would ever write anything that was a bit tricky if you had a little voice on your shoulder telling you this kind of thing. I'm a great believer also in the editing process. And if you have an excellent editor, they will help you make your book the best thing it can be. And certain things were taken out. I remember a rather interesting process is that it was being published in America and in the UK at the same time. And that was like a double system of the American editor was actually a little bit more sensitive, especially about some of the sexual things. Right. And, they just were getting uncomfortable and saying, maybe we should cut that out. And so there was a certain amount of debating between my London editor and my New York editor about the way to go. It's very difficult with censoring, and in a different way in fiction and a different way in non-fiction. In my non-fiction books, I've tried to, where I can, be as truthful as I can to the truth that I believe in, while knowing that each different person will have their truth who's been involved in the story, and I will try to make it okay where I can with people. I wanted to also bring up, because I think it fits rather well, that this book of mine, which is coming out in 3 months in May, called Stealing Dad, and it's already had adventures to do with censorship, in that it was inspired by when my father died 3 years ago, and he had arranged with his 4th wife that nobody but she would be at his funeral. None of his 6 children could be there.
Oh my God.
And this was such a big shock that it sent me into writing about this story. In the meantime, my stepmother, who I haven't seen since, got in touch with my publishers and tried to stop the book coming out, which is a sort of family censorship, or certainly was very angry about a post I'd put just announcing the publication of the book. So I think that censorship can come from all sorts of places. You have your inner censor, you have your publisher and your editor, who will tell you what they approve of or don't think you should really have in there. And then you have the outside world, because so much of fiction does have bits and pieces that are taken from our lives. This book is about a group of adult children who steal their father's body because they're so shocked at being kept away from the funeral. This did not happen.
Yeah.
All the characters are made up. But nevertheless, it's another example of where there's always this weaving in and out of real life, your own experiences, other things you've heard and seen. So censorship is kind of all around us.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. It's so poignant, absolutely. And, okay, Sofka, I've got one last question before I've got several more, but we'll have to take them offline. I want to end by asking you that, you touched upon this earlier, but you've also said that the inspiration for writing Putney began to take hold when your 2 daughters were sort of teenagers, and it was a time when the news was bringing forth a lot of stories about men charged with child sexual abuse. And I want to end by asking you to talk a little bit about how that lens of motherhood has shaped your storytelling, but also, if you don't mind my asking, how do you approach this conversation with your daughters? I have 2 young ones, and as a mother of 2 young daughters, the book spoke to me in voluminous ways. And I was like, I'm curious to ask Sofka, what is that conversation at home like? And do you see the conversation around consent changing?
The conversation has changed so dramatically that I feel I have learned a lot from my daughters. Even when they were young teenagers, they had so much more awareness of what consent meant, of what inappropriate touching is, of all sorts of things that I had no idea about at their age. When they were young teenagers, I was very touched by what children they still were, even if they were starting to sort of put on something looking rather like some makeup or some little high heels or something, but I realized how vulnerable and how young they were. But they showed me, I think they were growing up right through this big change that led to the Me Too movement, which came out right at the same time as Putney, which shows that we're all part of this mix.
Right.
These books don't come out of nowhere. It came out with the sort of things we were all thinking about and talking about. And both my daughters encouraged me very much with writing Putney, which was amazing. And they read an early draft and gave me comments and were very encouraging to me and were very passionate. They said, I hate Ralph.
Oh, yeah,
you know,
yeah,
they were quite black and white, actually.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
That's why one does this, right? For it to have that connect. I want to open it up to the floor. If we've got questions, please, do we have a mic that could be brought? The gentleman in the front, just going to have a mic brought to you.
Mine is a very basic question to understand the plot of your book. If I request you to tell me what are the two things a young, good-looking girl would be attracted to have a relationship with an older man?
Did you say why would a young girl be attracted to?
Why a young, good-looking girl will go for a much older man? Would you like to name two things, two qualities she's attracted to? Whatever. Two, please.
Are you looking for some tips?
You can think that, maybe. Another secret, if I like to disclose, 99% men in the world, they would love to go for a good-looking young girl. 99% men all over the world. This is men's psyche. They may not admit it, but this is their psyche. So if you want to give tips, you are going to be very generous.
Well, I think that the great thing is that even if, and I hope you're wrong about it being 99%, and I believe you're wrong because I've spoken to many men who are appalled by those sort of crimes when they do happen. And I think that a responsible man will know that he should not abuse his position of greater power and greater ability to maybe make a young girl fall in love with him. And this is what a man with the correct mindset will do. And I think even if he will have something very private inside him which might think what you were just expressing, I hope he will be horrified at himself and prevent himself acting on it, because it's been this sort of behavior of laughing about 99% of men would like to have an affair with a beautiful young girl underage that really creates... Okay. Oh, well, that's a bit better. That's a bit better. So what sort of age? Because the book is about a girl who's underage, and so the subject is underage. If you're talking about an 18-year-old, then, okay, you know, if the man is a lot older, we do start looking at questions of imbalance of power, but maybe that's a different conversation.
Do we have any other questions? There's a question there. Could we get a mic there, please?
My question is that we live in an era where there is extreme romanticization of the concept of pedophilia among the young girls and older men, and especially
There's romanticization, is that what you're saying?
Romanticization.
Okay.
Yeah. So especially young girls like me or younger than me see older men as a provider, as a protector, because in books it's so, you said even if the man is older than, they are so madly in love with the girl, they would do anything for it. But in real life it's a bit very complicated. Girls are like used and obviously lusted rather than loved. So how do you justify that with your book?
Did you get all of that?
So, what did you mean about how do you justify? I'll just come to you in a
Yeah.
second, Sofka. I think if I've understood correctly, she's sort of saying that this idea of an older man and a younger woman is kind of romanticized, and sometimes women tend to see it as he's a provider, security, etc. And so I think she wants you to comment on that interplay. Did I get that right? I mean, I'm not sure. I don't want to answer that, but I don't know if Sofka is justifying that in the book. So, right. Okay.
I would say that I'm absolutely not justifying it, but I felt that looking at it straight in the eye, rather than just saying, that's bad, that's the end of it, to understand why certain bad things, which I think by the end of the book, anybody does absolutely understand that I come down on one side and say that this is wrong. But I start off in a much more complicated way so that the reader changes sides, so that they might think, several women have said to me, especially after beginning the book, oh, I fell rather in love with Ralph myself. You know, he's very charismatic, he's very nice. But gradually it shows you how this story can happen and the different sides to it. Because I think if you just put everything in the same group and say, that's all bad, just send them to prison and we don't understand why it's happening. It's like when people talk about the war on drugs, but they don't explain that actually taking drugs can be such an extraordinary experience or such a wonderful experience. I mean, I don't want to say everybody should take drugs, but if you don't understand what's going on in that whole realm, then you can't do anything to combat it. So I think I was wanting to look at the whole subject, but not just say, that was bad, end of story. To understand it, I think for me it was the most important thing.
And I think when you read the book, that's one of the biggest things that comes out, that Sofka's looked at a multitude of perspectives. So we're actually also in the mind of the perpetrator, also in the mind of the friend, but eventually the thread ties back to, I mean, there's no justification really. No spoilers though, but sorry, Sofka. I think we're out of time, right? Thank you so much, Sofka. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you
very much.
Thank
I
you.
wish this could have been a longer conversation, but we'll take it outside. Thank you.